Just where did language come from and what does it take for a language to develop? If a group of children grew up isolated from the rest of the world, without any access to human language, would they create one of their own, and, if so, what would it look like and how long would it take? These questions have fascinated humans for centuries, and speculation on the matter dates back at least as early as ancient Greece.
Some early thinkers believed that without outside influence, a child might default to an ancient or ancestral language. Depending on the location and time period, Hebrew, Greek, Egyptian, and Sanskrit were all suggested as possibilities. This might sound far-fetched to us today, but ancient scholars gave the idea serious consideration. Several accounts, of varying credibility, describe attempts to isolate children from linguistic input and observe what language they would eventually speak.
The earliest such account comes from Herodotus, who described a supposed experiment by Psamtik I, who ruled Egypt from 664 to 610 BCE. Psamtik is said to have placed two newborns in the care of a shepherd with instructions to raise the children in isolation, with goats to provide milk as needed and no exposure to human speech. The goal was to determine whether the Egyptians or the Phrygians were the eldest of all men by observing whether these isolated children grew to speak the Egyptian or Phrygian language. According to legend, when the children were brought before Psamtik, they held out their hands and cried bikos, the Phrygian word for bread. This was taken as evidence that the Phrygians, rather than the Egyptians, were the oldest people. It is unlikely that these events unfolded exactly as described by Herodotus, but it does show that our fascination with the origins of language dates back thousands of years.
Another experiment said to be conducted by King Frederick II of Sicily was described in the 13th century by Franciscan friar Brother Salimbene. He made linguistic experiments on the vile bodies of hapless infants, bidding foster mothers and nurses to suckle and bathe and wash the children, but in no wise to prattle or speak with them, for he would have learned whether they would speak the Hebrew language, which had been the first, or Greek, or Latin, or Arabic, or perchance the tongue of their parents of whom they had been born.
However, it is uncertain whether this experiment actually occurred. If it was conducted, it appears it was a failure, judging from Brother Salimbene's description of the outcome. But he labored in vain, for the children could not live without clappings of the hands, and gestures, and gladness of countenance, and blandishments. Other accounts describe more extreme methods taken to ensure sufficient isolation. King James IV of Scotland is said to have left two infants, in the care of a mute nanny, on the isolated island of Inchkeith. Akbar the Great, a Mughal emperor of India, reportedly locked away a small group of children in a dedicated building known as the Gang Mahal, or dumb house, where any form of speech was forbidden.
Unfortunately, in addition to the obvious ethical concerns, documentation of these early experiments is sparse, making it difficult to determine whether they actually occurred as described or draw any conclusive results. In modern times, deliberate isolation of helpless infants to satisfy scientific curiosity is obviously no longer considered an acceptable approach, but natural experiments, often resulting from strange and sad circumstances, have continued to provide insight into our innate language capacity. Case studies of children who grew up in isolation, often due to abandonment or abuse, suggest that, perhaps unsurprisingly, these situations are not exactly ideal for language development. Perhaps the most well-known example of this is the case of Jeannie, a child who was found at the age of 13 after spending almost her entire life locked in a small room with minimal human interaction and almost no exposure to speech. At the time she was removed from this abusive situation, she did not speak. She quickly began imitating words and within the first year made impressive progress in learning to speak and understand English. However, she continued to show difficulty in fully acquiring English grammar, even many years later.
Similar language difficulties have been observed in other children isolated from human contact for extended periods of time. They do not generally develop strong language skills and, especially in the case of older children, many have difficulty learning language even if they are later exposed to it. This has been proposed as evidence for the critical period hypothesis, the idea that fully acquiring language is difficult or impossible after a certain age. However, in these cases, it's pretty much impossible to distinguish the effects of extreme social isolation and lack of linguistic input. It is often reported that twins develop their own secret languages for communication with each other. It is true that twins often converse with each other using speech unintelligible to others, including close family members. However, it wouldn't be quite correct to refer to this twin speak as a language in the strictest sense. In cases where the private speech of twins has been studied, the vast majority of vocabulary can be traced back to the languages the children have been exposed to, with changes to the sounds and simplified grammar. In fact, many children go through a phase where their speech is unintelligible, with all but the closest of family members. For twins, and sometimes other children close in age being raised together, the difference is that they have a readily available partner at a similar phase in speech development. Add in the fact that the twins will copy each other's speech just as readily as that of adults, and the feedback loop can quickly result in speech that sounds like gibberish to anyone but the twins themselves.